Adanna is 48, black, and owns half of a company that hates her. She hasn't been touched since her husband died, until Kyung-ho walks in. He's 30, he doesn't bow, and he sees the woman underneath the CEO mask. While the board prepares to steal her shares and ship her out of the country, she's in her office with her legs wrapped around a man who has nothing to lose. It's not a romance, it's a collision, and with his wife holding the photos that can destroy them both, the only question is who hits the floor first. The executive floor of the Onyx Tower felt like a freezer. It wasn't just the AC, it was the way the air died whenever Adanna walked into a room. She caught her reflection in the glass of her office door. Her skin was a deep, rich mahogany against the cream silk of her blouse. She kept her hair cropped close, a sharp, low-cut fade that showed off the elegant curve of her neck. She knew what the board members said when they thought she couldn't hear. The foreigner, the widow, the black woman. They hated that she owned half the shares. They hated even more that she looked better in a power suit than they ever would. She sat down, her slim waist disappearing into the high-back chair, her hips filling out the seat in a way that made most men stutter. She felt every bit of her 48 years today. Her body was a desert. 3 years since her husband died, and she'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched without a motive attached. Then came a knock, heavy, confident. "Come in," she said, bracing for another director with a fake smile and a hidden agenda. But it was Kyung-ho. He was the new operations director. He stood about 6'2" with broad shoulders. He was 30, wearing a pair of thick-rimmed glasses that should have made him look like a nerd, but on him, they just made his dark eyes look predatory. He had that clean, low-cut hair that looked like he'd just come from a barber. "CEO," he said. He didn't bow like the others. He just stepped in and closed the door. He was carrying a stack of logistics files. As he walked toward her desk, he reached up and undid the buttons on his cuffs, rolling the sleeves back with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Adanna's breath hitched. His forearms were a mess of corded muscle and thick, branching veins that looked like they'd been sculpted out of granite. He looked like a man who knew how to handle heavy things. "The board is meeting in the basement lounge," Kyung-ho said, dropping the files. He leaned over her desk, his glasses sliding slightly down the bridge of his nose. "They're talking about a vote of no confidence, something about cultural misalignment." Adanna felt that familiar cold spike of fear in her chest. They never stop, do they? Kyung-ho didn't pull away. He stayed leaned over, close enough that she could smell the faint, clean scent of cedarwood and skin. For the first time in years, the iron wall she kept around herself felt like it was made of paper. "Don't mind them," he whispered. His voice was a low, gravelly hum that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. "They're small men in big chairs. You're the only thing in this building that's real." He reached out, a move that should have been a fireable offense, and let his hand rest on the desk, inches from hers. She saw the pulse jumping in his wrist. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second, she wasn't the CEO. She was just a woman who was starving for a hand to hold her down. "I'm here, Adanna," he said, using her name like a secret. "It's going to be okay. I'll make sure of it." She looked at him, the broad shoulders, the calm heat in his eyes behind those glasses, and she felt her shoulders drop. The tension that had been coiled in her spine for a decade just vanished. She felt a sudden, terrifying urge to cry, or to reach across the wood and tear his shirt open. "You should go," she breathed, her voice shaking. "People will see." Kyung-ho didn't move. He just gave her a slow, dark smile. They've never seen a man who knows what he wants before. He turned and walked out, the ghost of his presence lingering in the air like a burn. Adanna sat back, her thighs pressing together as a slow, heavy warmth began to bloom between them. She was horny, properly, painfully horny for the first time in an age. And as she watched him through the glass, she knew he was the only person that could fill the hole her life had become. The rain in Seoul doesn't just fall, it colonizes the city. It was one of those nights where the sky stayed a bruised purple, and the humidity made the silk of Adanna's slip dress cling to the small of her back like a second, unwanted skin. She was in her penthouse in Hanamdong, a place that felt more like a showroom than a home. The silence was heavy. It was the kind of quiet that makes you hear the blood rushing in your own ears. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of neat bourbon in her hand, watching the lights of the Han River blur. 48. She felt it in the stiffness of her neck, but mostly she felt it in the hollow space between her ribs. She'd spent 3 years playing the grieving widow, the untouchable CEO, the black queen of a logistics empire that wanted to swallow her whole. Her body was a well-maintained machine that hadn't been put into gear in an eternity. She closed her eyes and saw those forearms again. Kyung-ho. He was 18 years her junior, a gap that should have felt like a canyon, but instead felt like a dare. He didn't look at her like she was a monument. He looked at her like she was a meal. Should I fire him, she thought, the bourbon burning a path down her throat? Should I send him back to the warehouse floor before he ruins me? But then she remembered the way he'd said her name. Not CEO Park, not ma'am, just Adanna. Meanwhile, across the city in a cramped, modern apartment that smelled of stale air and expensive candles, Kyung-ho was watching his wife. She was beautiful, the kind of sharp, polished Korean beauty that looked perfect in photos. She was 28, but lately she looked at him like he was a piece of furniture she'd grown tired of. She was currently perched on the edge of the sofa, her thumb flying across her phone screen, a small, secretive smile playing on her lips. Kyung-ho stood in the doorway, his shirt off, the corded muscle of his back tight. He'd been home for 2 hours. She hadn't asked about his day. She hadn't even looked up when he walked in. "You're staying up late," he said. His voice was flat. She didn't look up. "Work stuff, Kyung-ho. Go to sleep." He knew she was lying. He'd known for months about the guy, some hedge fund prick with a silver Porsche and a soul made of plastic. Usually, the knowledge felt like a dull ache, a bruise he'd learned to live with. But tonight, it felt like nothing. He felt a strange, cold clarity. He wasn't angry anymore. He was just done. He thought about the way Adanna had looked when he leaned over her desk, the way her breath hitched, the way her dark skin seemed to glow under the office lights. She was a woman who was starving, and he was a man who was tired of wasting his hunger on a ghost. "I'm going back to the office," Kyung-ho said. "Operations glitch at the dock." She finally looked up, her eyes narrowing behind her designer frames. "It's midnight." "Logistics doesn't sleep," he said. He didn't wait for her to argue. He didn't care if she did. He was out the door in 5 minutes. The Onyx Tower was a skeleton of glass and steel at this hour. The lobby was empty, the security guard nodding off behind the marble desk. Kyung-ho didn't go to the operations floor. He hit the button for the 70. The executive floor was dim, lit only by the emergency lights and the glow of the city outside. He walked toward the CEO suite, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. He knew she'd be there. He'd seen the light from the street. He pushed the door open without knocking. Adanna was sitting at her desk, but she wasn't working. She was leaning back, her eyes closed, her hand resting at the base of her throat. She'd changed out of the power suit. She was wearing a deep emerald silk dress that slid over her curves like water. She opened her eyes when the door clicked shut. She didn't look surprised. "Director So," she whispered. The word sounded like a confession. He didn't say a word. He walked across the room, the distance between them shrinking until he was standing right over her. He reached out and removed his glasses, setting them on the mahogany desk with a soft clack. Without the frames, his eyes were raw, dark, and terrifyingly focused. He leaned down, his broad shoulders blocking out the rest of the world. He didn't touch her, not yet. He just breathed in the scent of her, bourbon and vanilla, and something deep, feminine, and wild. "You're working too hard, Adanna," he murmured. She looked up at him, her pulse visible in the hollow of her neck. "I have a board to fight. I have a company to save." "Not tonight," he said. He reached out, his hand sliding into the short, soft hair at the back of her head. His fingers were warm, his skin rough against hers. Adanna let out a jagged, broken breath. She felt the tears prickling behind her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer, overwhelming shock of being seen. "Kyung-ho," she choked out. "We can't. Someone will come." "Let them," he said. He pulled her up out of the chair. He didn't do it gently. He moved with a firm, masculine gravity that didn't give her room to argue. He backed her against the cold glass of the window, the entire city of Seoul spread out beneath them like a carpet of glitter. He kissed her then. It wasn't a movie kiss. It was a collision. It was 3 years of silence and 10 years of neglect crashing together in the dark. Adanna's hands flew to his chest, her fingernails digging into the fabric of his shirt as she let out a low, guttural moan. She was wet, soaking, heavy and aching. She felt him against her, the hard evidence of his desire pressing into her thigh, and she almost fell apart right there. Finally, her mind screamed. Finally. She felt his hand slide down, his palm hot against her waist, pulling her flesh against him. She was crying now, silent tears of relief and hunger, as she buried her face in the crook of his neck. He felt so solid, so real. "I've got you," he muttered into her ear, his voice a low growl that vibrated through her entire body. "I've got you, Adanna." Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside the glass box, the air was finally starting to burn. "If you made it here, I have a serious appeal to make to you. My grandma threatened to disown and send me out of her house if you guys don't like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. So if you don't want me out in the streets, please, my beloved viewers, that's the least you can do for me now." The glass was cold against Adanna's back, but Kyung-ho was a furnace. Her fingernails dug into the meat of his shoulders, bunching the fabric of his expensive shirt. She was shaking, not the kind of tremble you get from a breeze, but the deep, structural shudder of a building about to collapse. It had been an eternity since someone had looked at her and didn't see a paycheck or a political hurdle. "Kyung-ho," she gasped, her voice breaking. "Someone, the night security." "Doors locked," he muttered against the curve of her neck. His voice was a low, jagged rasp that sent a fresh jolt of electricity straight to her thighs. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his glasses long gone, his eyes dark and fixed on her like she was the only thing left on earth. He reached down, his large, veined hand finding the hem of her emerald silk dress. He didn't ask, he just gathered the fabric, the silk sliding upward with a soft, shushing sound that seemed deafening in the quiet office. When his palm hit the bare skin of her thigh, Adanna let out a jagged moan that she didn't recognize as her own. She felt heavy, slick, and so goddamn ready she could have screamed. "You've been alone too long," he whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. He hiked her up, his strength effortless, and sat her right on the edge of that mahogany desk. The wood was cold, a stark contrast to the heat radiating off him. Adanna wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him into the cradle of her hips, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She was crying, just a little, It was the release of years of holding it together, of being the iron widow in a country that didn't want her. Every time his thumbs grazed her skin, a layer of that armor peeled away. "Look at me," he commanded. She opened her eyes, her vision blurred by tears. Kyung-ho was staring at her with a terrifying intensity. He looked younger than 30 in the dim light, but the way he moved was ancient. He reached for his belt, the metallic clack of the buckle echoing off the glass walls. "The board," she choked out, her head lolling back as he found the sensitive skin beneath her ear. "They'll destroy us if they find out." "Let them try," he said, his hand sliding between them, finding the damp heat that had been neglected for 3 years. When he touched her, Adanna's world narrowed down to a single point of sensation. She was so wet it was embarrassing, her body betraying every second of the celibacy she'd worn like a badge of honor. He entered her with a slow, deliberate pressure that felt like he was reclaiming territory. She was so full, stretched, occupied, finally seen. She buried her face in his shoulder to muffle a scream, her teeth grazing his skin. It wasn't polite, it wasn't corporate, it was raw and messy, and exactly what she needed. While they were breaking every rule in the building, miles away in their sleek, silent apartment, Sora was staring at the front door, and she'd spent the last year thinking she was the smartest person in the room. She was currently wearing a silk robe that cost more than Kyung-ho's first car, her phone glowing on the nightstand with a missed text from the guy she'd been seeing, the one who'd stopped answering her calls 3 days ago. She'd spent months withdrawing her attention from Kyung-ho like it was a weapon. She'd go days without speaking to him, waiting for him to beg, waiting for him to notice. But tonight, when he'd walked out without a word, something shifted. The silence in the apartment felt different. It didn't feel like a stalemate anymore. It felt like an exit. Sora stood up, her bare feet silent on the heated floors. She walked into the kitchen and saw his wedding ring sitting in a small ceramic dish by the sink. He never took it off. Not for the gym, not for work. She picked it up, the gold cold in her palm. A sickening realization started to crawl up her spine. Kyung-ho wasn't the type to forget things. He was the type to leave them. She grabbed her phone and dialed his number. It went straight to voicemail. Back at the tower, the phone on the mahogany desk was vibrating, buzzing against the wood like a trapped insect. Neither of them heard it. Adanna was lost in the rhythm, her fingers clenching in Kyung-ho's hair, her body arching off the desk as she neared the edge. She felt the tears flowing freely now, a mix of pleasure and the sheer, terrifying weight of the secret they were building. "Kyung-ho," she sobbed. He didn't slow down. He gripped her hips, his thumbs bruising the skin, his own breath coming in ragged, heavy hitches. He was the only thing keeping her from floating away into the dark Seoul sky. At that moment, she didn't care about the board or the shares or the fact that she was 48 and he was 30. She just cared about the way he filled her up, erasing the ghost of her husband and the coldness of the world, one heavy stroke at a time. The sun hadn't even cleared the horizon before the sterile reality of the Onyx Tower snapped back into place. Adanna sat in the back of her car, watching the neon signs of Gangnam flicker off one by one. Her body felt heavy, warm, but heavy. There was a dull ache in her inner thighs that she hadn't felt in a decade, a physical reminder of Kyung-ho that made her pulse quicken every time the car hit a pothole. She adjusted the collar of her trench coat, making sure the silk scarf hid the faint, blooming bruise on her collarbone. She looked at her phone. 6 missed calls from her head of legal. The board wasn't waiting for her to have a moment. They were moving. When she walked onto the executive floor at 8 a.m., Kyung-ho was already there. He was standing by the glass-walled conference room, talking to two senior directors who looked like they'd been carved out of old wood. He'd swapped his rumpled shirt for a crisp, charcoal gray one. His glasses were back on, the light reflecting off the lenses so she couldn't see his eyes. He looked every bit the professional, 30-year-old rising star. As Adanna walked past, she felt the air between them vibrate. It was like a physical hum. Kyung-ho didn't look up, but he shifted his stance, his broad shoulders blocking the director's view of her for a split second. It was a subtle move, protective, quiet. "CEO Park," he said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. "The logistics update for the Busan port is on your desk." "Thank you, Director Seoul," she replied. Her voice didn't shake. She was back in the mask. She retreated to her office, but the peace was short-lived. 5 minutes later, Director Moon, a man who'd been trying to oust her since her husband's funeral, pushed his way in without a knock. "You're late, Adanna," Moon said, sitting in the chair Kyung-ho had occupied just hours before. He sniffed the air, his eyes narrowing. "New perfume? It's aggressive." Adanna felt a cold sweat prickle her hairline. "It's a long morning, Moon. What do you want?" "The board has questions about the miscellaneous expenses in the shipping department," Moon said, leaning forward. "And they're curious why the new operations director has been spending so much time on this floor after hours. People talk, you know. They see the lights on. They see a young, ambitious man staying late with a lonely widow." It was a warning shot, a messy, ugly one. "He's doing his job," Adanna said, her voice like iron. "Something the rest of you seem to have forgotten how to do." While Moon was busy trying to find a crack in her armor, Sora was at home, doing her own version of an audit. She sat on the floor of the bedroom, Kyung-ho's gym bag open in front of her. She'd gone through his pockets, his car, his cloud storage. Nothing. He was too smart for that. But then she found it, a small, crumpled receipt from a high-end boutique in the hotel district. A silk scarf, deep emerald. Kyung-ho didn't buy her scarves. He didn't buy her anything anymore. Sora felt a hot, bubbling rage rise in her chest. It wasn't because she loved him. That ship had sailed when she started seeing the Porsche guy. It was the insult of it. She was supposed to be the one in control. The idea of Kyung-ho, her reliable husband, finding someone else made her stomach turn. She grabbed her keys. She didn't have a plan, but she had a feeling. And in Seoul, feelings usually led to the same few zip codes. Back at the tower at 2 p.m., Adanna was in the break room, pouring a cup of coffee she didn't want when Kyung-ho walked in. The room was small, tucked away behind the elevators. For 3 seconds, they were alone. He didn't waste time. He stepped into her space, his chest nearly brushing her shoulder. He reached past her for a sugar packet, his arm grazing hers. "They're watching," she whispered, her heart hammering. "I know," he murmured, his voice so low it was almost a growl. "I'm not stopping." "Kyung-ho, if they see..." He turned his head just enough to look at her over the rim of his glasses. The predatory heat was back, raw and unapologetic. "The board thinks they can take what's yours. They don't realize I've already taken what's mine." He stepped back just as a junior secretary walked in. Adanna almost dropped her mug. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was the thrill of the ledge. She watched him walk away, noticing the way his shirt pulled across his back. She felt that slow, familiar wetness returning, a subconscious pull that made her want to lock the door and forget the company existed. But as she turned to leave, she caught sight of a woman standing in the lobby through the glass partitions. A beautiful, sharp-featured Korean woman with fire in her eyes, arguing with the security guard. Sora had arrived, and the slow simmer was about to turn into a flashover. Adanna pulled her coat tight as she left the lobby. The night air was thick, but for the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't just a ghost in a suit. She was still thinking about the heat of Kyung-ho's hand against her waist. Across town, Sora sat in her dark living room, the gold of her wedding ring catching the light of her phone. She didn't cry. She didn't even look at the divorce papers. She just pulled up a contact she'd ignored for months. Director Moon. She hit dial. It didn't even ring twice before he picked up. "Director," Sora said, her voice like a cold blade. "I have the photos. I'm ready to talk." Moon's voice came through, low and satisfied. "Then the board meets at 8. Bring everything." Sora hung up. She looked out at the Seoul skyline and smiled.